Wonderful. Thanks everyone for joining. Let's give it a minute or so just for everyone to come in and join. But basically today what we're going to be doing is doing some training session on the carbon calculator. Wates have asked you to report as part of their overall strategy. Basically I'll go through how you'll do that, and basically what's required of you by when, etc. Just to let you know, the session will be running until 11. And we'll have time at the end for questions, and probably hopefully about 10-15 minutes at the end. So we'll have plenty of time for you to ask questions about anything covered today. So I'm aware that it's a couple of minutes past 10, so I think it's probably good to make a start. So I'll just introduce myself quickly, and then I'll hand over to Wates, who will then kind of do a bit of an introduction as to why we're here. So my name's Annabelle James. I work for Action Sustainability, which is the company behind the carbon calculator, which is the platform that you'll be using to report your carbon emissions through. So yeah, I'll hand over.
Hello. Oh,
Hi,
thanks, Annabelle.
perfect.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah, we can.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for taking time this morning to be part of this session for Waits. We're really pleased that you were able to make it, and we hope you get a lot from it. But just to give you some background, Waits, we are, as you know, you are part of our valuable supply chain, and as a company, we are firmly on the path to net zero. And one of the things we've done in recent times is we've actually set our science-based targets, and that includes a target of 46.2% reduction in our scopes 1 and 2 carbon emissions by 2030. And also before that, 2027, for 89% of our supply chain to have set their own science-based targets. That is the near-term targets. And then our long-term net zero target is 2045, which is actually 5 years ahead of the UK's national net zero target at 2050. Now, there is no way we can deliver this alone. We are in this together as a strategic supply chain. So whatever happens in your businesses, what you supply to us as Wates on our project sites, all adds up to the total carbon for Wates. And just to give you an idea of how the scale of emissions, because on our scope 3 emissions as an entity is essentially your emissions that have been added on to ours. That's currently about 98% of our overall carbon emissions, which shows you the huge importance of us working together on this journey. And what we've come to understand over the last few months and year or so is that a lot of our suppliers, of our supply chain partners, actually want to get on the journey. They want to do the right things. They want to be sustainable in their operations, in their transport, in their offices, in the materials, goods, and services they supply to Wates and to other tier one contractors. However, there's a little bit of a need in terms of them being able to calculate their carbon emissions in a very easy way, which means that they don't have to buy specialist tools. Hence, we have partnered with the Supply Chain Sustainability School for this carbon tool. And it's actually a platform where you can go. It's, like I said again, I will emphasize it, it's free to use for yourselves, and it's just as good as any other paid for, expensive tool out there, and it will help you to calculate your carbon emissions. And importantly, once you've used the tool, which Annabelle and the team will go through, Yasmin and the team will go through today, explain how it works, it also gives you an opportunity um, to attribute some of those emissions to us based on your turnover as a business. So that way, Waste can easily establish what our overall scope 3 emissions are in a much more accurate way. And that way, we're able to make the right decisions at the right times with regards to how we procure, what materials we want to take on at any point in time, what services, and importantly, working with yourselves, taking up on all that valuable knowledge in your distribution networks, in your production, in your services networks, all of that, so that as Wates of the company, we can help hit that net zero target, which, I mean, I'm sure there is no uh, we're not we've all gone past that period where we're thinking, is there a problem? Clearly there is a problem with the climate, and if we want to avoid a climate catastrophe, it's important that every one of us are involved in this. So we're this is about us working together, and that's why we've invited you today. And hopefully, the team will take you through, and we will you will be in a place where you can easily use the calculator, and then from the calculator apportion to weights a proportion of your emissions, which then forms our scope 3 emissions. So thank you very much. And as you listen on, please, if you've got some of your colleagues as well, I'll just say who you feel need to be on this webinar, but they're not able to make this one, there is another one tomorrow. So Annabelle, again, at the end, will share that information. So thank you very much. And I'll hand back to Annabelle and the team.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for providing that context. So what I'll do now is I'll share my screen and just go into what the carbon calculator is, how it works, and I'll show you how actually the reporting interface looks like as well. So I'll just share my screen. Please let me know if you can see this. One moment. Um, Perfect. So hopefully you can now see the slide deck. So, as I said, a bit of an agenda for today is we'll go a little bit about why this matters. I know I've kind of already covered that, but just so that got a bit more context, why it's important. I'll do a bit of a brief introduction into carbon emissions, just at a very high level, just to kind of provide some context of how the carbon calculator actually works. And then what I'll do is I'll go into a system demo where I'll walk through with you the report, what data is asked for, how to enter data, tips and tricks, that sort of thing. And then I'll also kind of dot in as well some tips on how to actually collect your data and that sort of thing. And then we'll also have time at the end for a Q&A. And as kind of said, if you do have any questions throughout, if you just drop them in the Q&A section and then we'll address them at the end. And if for whatever reason we don't have time to answer all the questions in the chat, I'll follow up with everyone separately as well, so that everyone's questions are answered. So as I said, it's not necessarily something that's a shock to anyone that climate change is something that's a really pressing issue that's affecting everyone. And there's really something, unfortunately, is not going to go away by itself. So it's really something that we need to work together collaboratively to kind of address and tackle. And as a kind of in industry, it's really important that we start taking responsibility for our organisation's carbon emissions and obviously the implications that has on kind of wider climate issues. And I think we always see it in the news, increasing frequency of extreme weather events and that sort of thing. So it's really kind of something that if we don't address, it's just going to get worse and worse. So it's really something that we all have responsibility to address, but also something that we need to work together to actually be successful at doing so. So what are carbon emissions? How do they work? So at a basic level, carbon emissions are broken down into three different what we call scopes, basically categories. So scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So scope 1 emissions are direct emissions that your organisation produces. So things like if you've got a company fleet of vehicles, the carbon emissions that are produced when you drive those vehicles, they would be direct emissions because you're purchasing that fuel, using that car, etc. Scope 2 is an indirect form, so this is basically electricity usage and everything that goes along with that. And then scope 3 is basically everything else. So this is things like your water usage, your waste usage, your materials, lots of different things. It's not super important that you know this in depth. I just included this in case you were interested in kind of how this works and how this all feeds together. But as I said, it's not critical that you understand this or that you need to think about this really. It was just more so for context, so that you've got that awareness. So the carbon calculator itself is based off the greenhouse gas protocol, if any of you are interested, which is basically a recognized document which basically outlines best practice for carbon reporting and accounting. So if any of you are interested, that's kind of how it's based off with the industry standard. And if any of you are interested as well, the carbon calculator, as it's kind of clear in the name, the carbon calculator calculates your carbon emissions. And to do this calculation, it uses the government DEFRA, what they call emission factors or conversion factors. I'll go into that a little bit later on, but if any of you are interested in kind of how the where the emissions are coming from, how they're calculated, it's by that. So I've said a lot of things about carbon emissions, about the climate, etc. But really, why we're here is about the carbon calculator itself and how you can, as an organisation, start measuring and monitoring your organisation's carbon emissions. So the carbon footprint calculator is an online platform, so basically a website, that allows you to calculate your carbon emissions and then crucially distribute them to your clients. So for example, Wates and any of the clients that you have, you can basically report your organization's carbon emissions and then say this sliver is related to Wates, and then you'd apportion, so that's the process we call it, apportion that percentage of your overall emissions to waste based on your turnover and spend with them. I'll go into that a little bit more detail as we go through the session, but just so you understand the premise, you only need to report your data at a top full organization level, not at a project specific level. Like you don't have to work out exactly your water use for projects with Wates, for example. It's just your business as a whole. And as I said, the allocation is through that apportionment method. And I think the key kind of aspects I really want to point out to you is that, as we said, it's free for you to use. So it's paid for by Waits and other clients, but it's free for you, their supply chain, to go in and report. And probably one of the main benefits for you is that you get your own personal dashboard as a part of this. So your business will have your own dashboard where all the data that you submit will feed into, and then we'll kind of show you graphs and different components, which I'll go through with you to basically see what your company's emissions are. And this can be particularly useful when looking at where maybe you've got hotspots, basically where more of your emissions coming from as a part of your operations. So, for example, you might submit your report, and then in the dashboard you can see that a lot of your emissions are actually coming from business, like from travel, from transportation, for example, or you might see that a lot of your emissions are coming from materials and that sort of thing. So it's really just could be really useful if you haven't done this before to start being able to get a view of what your company's emissions look like. And just on that as well, if you're sitting here thinking, we've already calculated our emissions, we know how to do this, we don't need this. There we have a simplified version of the report, which I'll show you how to do. But basically, if you've already calculated your company's carbon emissions in terms of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, you have that information for 2024. Or will have that information for 2024, you can complete the simplified report, which is essentially a pared down version where you enter scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 in terms of tons of carbon equivalent, and then basically a bit of company information, and then you can submit that report and apportion to Wates as applicable. So you can kind of use the carbon calculator whichever way works for you. But if you haven't calculated that before, that's no problem. You can use the full form report, and that'll be the focus of the walkthrough that I do, but I'll show you what it would look like as well if you were using the simplified report. But it's really important to still stay on the webinar just so that we see the dashboards and the context and everything else as we go through. So as I said before, and I'll just reiterate, the carbon calculator, you don't need to be doing any calculations yourself. So it's very much you are entering raw activity data. So that's things like your water usage, your electricity usage, your gas usage, things like that in just litres, kilograms, whatever the units are in the report. And then the system will automatically calculate the carbon emissions associated with those activities. And so as you can see here, it's activity data times emission factor equals carbon emission. So that emission factor, that blue circle that I'm referring to, is those DEFRA conversion factors. So the government each year publishes a set of quite comprehensive conversion factors. It says for whatever amount of diesel car petrol, this is the multiplication factor you'd calculate to then calculate the carbon emissions that that activity produces. And as I said, the conversion factor that the system uses is DEFRA, and with the exception of the materials tab, which actually follows the emission factors from Bath ICE. And that's purely because the conversion factors are more comprehensive for materials in that section. So just to kind of put this into a bigger picture, you're not alone in doing this, and Wates aren't alone in asking you to do this. We've got loads and loads of clients asking their supply chains to do this. This is just kind of a snapshot on the screen, asking them their supply chains to report their carbon emissions. And we've got, actually it's probably a little bit high now, but well over 1,700 suppliers who are actively reporting their carbon emissions using the carbon calculator and then apportioning their emissions across their clients, as you can see on the screen here. So this is really part of a bigger thing. We've got lots of different people using it, we've got lots of supply chains using it, we've got lots of clients using it. And that's really beneficial for you because you can then only submit one report and then it's apportion your emissions to multiple of your clients. So obviously, for the purpose of this, obviously Wates are asking you to do this because you're part of their kind of target supply chain. But also, when you're doing your report, you might see other clients in the apportionment section, and I'll show you that later. There's a drop-down list that you can apportion to clients. If, for example, you've got a project also with BUK, for example, or with Robertson, you can also apportion to them as well. So it's really, really good because you only have to do one report and can then apportion to different clients and then not have to basically do the same exercise multiple times across multiple different platforms, which is a really, really beneficial thing to do. And also, just from a resourcing perspective, we appreciate that it does take time to do this. So if you only have to do it once per year, then we're kind of trying to make it as streamlined and simple for you as possible. So I'll just do a high level of the top features. I've already spoken around these, but just to summarize, and then what I'll do is go into the actual demo portion of the session, where I'll just go through with you what the report looks like, how you fill it out, and then we'll go into the dashboard as well, so you can kind of see what sort of data you'll get from it, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. So I'll start with the kind of summary, just so I've kind of summarized everything I've spoken about. So essentially, the main features of the carbon calculator are that, as I said, you measure your company's emissions and then you apportion data to your clients from that. So you're not having to kind of calculate project specific data, which obviously is a lot more difficult to get. As I said before, there's two formats of report that you can fill out. So we've got the simplified report and also the full form report as well. And so that simplified ones, if you've already calculated your emissions outside the system or just enter them directly. The full forms, if you need to calculate it using activity data and the system calculates it for you. As I mentioned before, this is an annual report, so you only have to submit one report once a year, and then you can allocate your emissions across different of your clients to really kind of reduce that reporting burden. And lastly, the probably key component that I think is really beneficial for you is that you do get your own dashboard and you can actually see your company's data, and Waits won't see your full organization's data. That's purely for you to kind of get a view of how your company is doing, what are your emissions, and even just kind of where your emissions are actually coming from, which I think is really, really useful. So, and this is just a kind of snapshot of this, but it's a bit of a sneak preview to the demo I'm about to do. So what I'll do is I'll just briefly stop sharing my screen and I will get up the portal just to kind of show you what the system looks like. So just give me one moment. And just you can see in the chat, can we get a copy of this deck? Slides will be sent out afterwards, so you have this to refer back to. So yeah, but I'll address kind of the rest of the questions at the end if that's okay, just so that we don't disrupt the flow. So what I'll do is I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you can now see a form. So this is what the carbon calculator looks like. When you log on, this is basically what you'll see. So I'll show you how to create an account afterwards, but basically it's just like creating any other online account. It's hopefully fairly self-explanatory, but I'll just go through that afterwards. But I'll just show you the reporting interface first, and then we'll kind of go on to the more practical aspects. So when you log onto your account, you'll see that it's broken down into 4 steps. So this is really just to help it make it easier to know that you've completed the step and just kind of make the report as simple to use as possible. So the first step here is this really top information. So this is where you select the reporting period. So for example, for this, we're doing 2024's data. So just to clarify, Waits are asking you to collect and submit your data for 2024. And the deadline for that will be the 5th of March. I'll reiterate that again at the end, but just so you know kind of timeframes for this, that's the timeline we're kind of working towards. So you click the year here, And then this section here, which is select a report type, is for that simplified versus full form report. So if you click yes this question to do you already know your carbon emissions, you click yes, and then it would refresh and take you basically to the shortened report. For the purpose of this, I'm going to go through the full report, but I'll show you which sections will be included in the simplified report if that's applicable to you. Once you've done this, you've collected your year, you've selected that, save, and then you can see that actually this kind of orange yellow question mark has now changed to a green tick. So that's when you know that section is complete. The second step is some company information. So this is a new addition to the report. And what we've done is we've included this because we're wanting to collect this data so that we can then create industry benchmarks. So the ultimate goal is for you to be able to then compare your emissions to an average organisation of a similar size in a similar sector, for example. So you can see how you sit compared to the average for kind of different parameters. So this is why we started collecting this information to be able to create those to have that in the future. So that's the only purpose it's used for. It's not used for anything else. It's purely for those benchmarks. So you get to choose your sector or sectors. So with this, there's a selection of different sectors. Obviously, you might sit across several. So just really select as many that are applicable to you. So you can click as many as you need. And then there's about kind of you contractor or consultant, etc., where your headquarters located, location, etc. Is basically the very basic questions, very high level. They're quite the generic bands. They're not super specific. And as I said, this is for those benchmarks in the future. When you've completed this, click save, and then that'll go to a green tick. As I haven't completed it, it's not gone to a green tick, but it would do if it was if it'd been completed. So the main part is the step 3, which is the actual report itself. So here you'll see that this is broken down into these tabs across the top. So, I mean, firstly, I'll just kind of say that I appreciate this does look quite like quite a lot of information. You'll be relieved to hear that the transport tab is one of the larger tabs. Electricity, for example, is a much shorter tab. But really, it's broken down like this just to make it more straightforward to enter the data and just kind of go in and out. So with the report, it auto saves, so you don't have to worry about saving it if you want to go in. You've got your water data in, you want to enter that, and then a couple of days later you want to come back in and add your electricity usage, for example. You can do that. You can dip in and out of the report, and we can have multiple people from your organization actually kind of on your account and who can go into the report and add different information. So if it'd be easier for you to have, a team of a few people responsible for filling out different areas of this report, you can absolutely do that. But conversely, if you just want to have one person responsible, that's also fine. And just as well to add that with your account, if you're responsible for actually completing the report, but you've got other people in the business who are interested in having access to the data and seeing the dashboard, you can do that. It's really up to you. There's no limit on the number of users who have access to your own personal account. So with the reporting interface, as I said, it's broken down into these sections. What I'm going to do is I'll go through each tab. I'll go through the transport tab in a bit more detail, just so you can understand how to actually use view the report, fill it out. But then the kind of rest of the tabs, I'll just go through a bit more high level just to kind of show you what information is asked for, but not in such a granular way, because I appreciate that would be quite dry. So the first tab is transport. So this section is broken down into company transport and third party. So if you have any questions throughout the report about the sections, there is this I section kind of next to all the bold kind of subheadings, which gives you more information about what this kind of bit is asking for, essentially. So if you do have any questions, you can refer to that. But basically, company transport is any vehicles that are directly owned or controlled by your organisation. So that's things like if you've got a fleet of company vehicles, or you've got employees with company cars, that sort of thing. It's really any vehicle that is your vehicle, basically, as an organization. With third party, it's basically any other vehicles, anything that's third party, as the name says. So it can be things like obviously privately owned vehicles for employees, but also public transport, hire cars, that sort of thing, really any kind of rented or hired vehicles here. And the sections are very similar. So for example, diesel car, you can see here it's in miles. With these ones, you do have the option to flick between kilometers and miles. So if you do calculation kilometers for whatever reason, you can enter that instead. And with this, and this is a general rule for the report, which obviously sounds quite obvious, but I think it's definitely worth reiterating, is to always check the units, because obviously that can have a really big impact on things, particularly if you've entered it thinking it's kilograms, it's actually tons, for example. Also, that could have massive implications on your emissions. We can amend that if needed, we can correct it, but it is important to enter the data correctly. So to always look at the units just to make sure they're correct. So you can see here we've got a section of vehicles, but also we've got another section which is basically like an expanded section, which is to kind of make it not too cluttered. So if, for example, you've got any hybrid vehicles, um, electric vehicles, or motorbikes, etc., there's basically a more comprehensive selection here. So, for example, if you've got an electric van, for example, you've entered the number of miles that company-owned van has driven. With the third party, we've got some extra options as well. We've actually got not only those kind of hybrid vehicles and electric, but also air travel, both domestic and international, train travel, taxi, buses, etc. So there's a lot of kind of granularity of different transport types here if you do collect that information. So on that, I think that's probably a good segue actually to one of the main things I think, if you take away anything from today, is that you don't need to have absolutely all of this data. If you don't have it all, don't let that stop you from submitting the report, because the thing is that this is everything that you can collect as an organization to start measuring your carbon footprint. But if, for example, you don't have a record of the waste that you produced, for example, you can still submit your report without that waste section. And maybe when we're looking next year, 2025, for example, that could be something you could consider looking at ways to actually start recording and collecting that information. So when you submit your 2025 report, you've got that data to submit. But I think the thing is with this is that it obviously depends on where you're at as an organization with reporting your carbon emissions. But if this is one of the first times or the first time you've done it, we're not expecting you to have all of this information because you might simply not have it recorded. And I think it's that kind of, the classic thing is don't let perfection be the enemy of good. And I think that we'd rather you submit the report and then just kind of look at expanding the kind of breadth of information you're collecting rather than thinking, oh, I'm not going to submit it because we don't have X information. So I think that's a really important thing to cover. Obviously, if you do have all this information, fantastic, submit it. But just submit what you've got. I think it's really kind of the key part. And obviously work towards having a full set of data for your business. And the more data you collect, the more accurate your carbon footprint will be. So it's really in your interest to be collecting kind of all this data so that you can have a really accurate view of your company's carbon emissions. So to actually fill out the report, you simply enter numbers in here, basically. What you'll see is if I was to add this, for example, this is coming up with a little flag, and this is just telling me that actually this is significantly different to the previous submissions. Just to clarify, this is a test account, so it's a demo account, so ignore the numbers. They do not make sense. It's just purely for demonstration purposes. But basically, if the data that you entered for 2024, if you've already submitted one in 2023, for example, and that value is significantly different to the previous year's submission, it'll just flag it just to let you know. So often it'll just be because you've traveled more in a petrol car, for example, but it's just important. It's just a little validation thing just to see, oh, actually, I've put the decimal point in the wrong place or whatever, I've missed off a zero, I've added whatever. It's just kind of just a way to just gauge if the data you're entering is correctly. So if that comes up, you still can submit it. Don't be alarmed, but it's just a flag that it's quite different to the previous year's submission. If, for example, you don't have a petrol company van, you just click NA. Just important to note with all the metrics, all the kind of questions here in the report, you either need to submit data or select NA. So either or is thing because basically you need to interact with the metric so that you kind of said yes or no. And just to kind of clarify with this third party transport, so this can include things like basically with the transport, any transport that's relating to your company's operations. So things like employee commuting would be included in this as data you can start collecting. And on that point as well, if you haven't got a log, which you may not, um, or potentially probably won't, of the exact number of miles that every employee has travelled in the last, in 2024, for example, to and from work, what you can do is things what's called basically proxy data. So you can calculate an accurate approximation of what that value actually is. So, for example, you could either do it on an employee by employee basis. So you could say, okay, X employee, they live 10 miles away from the office, they go into the office 3 days a week, and therefore they're traveling 60 miles a week there and back to the office. And then over the year, that's whatever number. And then you could add that together for all your employees and put that in, either diesel car, diesel petrol, whatever mode of transport um, they're collecting. If you needed to take it one step, I guess almost more broadly, you could calculate, and this may be a good place to start, and actually may work better um, if you kind of new to this, but obviously if you can get it per employee, that's better. But if this is the first year doing it and you want to calculate an approximation, what you can do is take the average, so take the number of employees that you have working for your organization going to a specific place of work, the average number of days each employee goes in, and the average distance that they live from the office, and basically calculate on average across the year, this is how far our employees collectively travel. So that's a valid option. With things like this, any kind of way you've calculated data, it's really important you just put in this comment section here, just a little explanation of how you calculated it, just so we know how you've done that, but also so when it comes to next year, if you've forgotten how you got that data, you can just go back into your report and have a look and see, okay, yeah, actually we did this last year, whatever. So just to point that out, that if you haven't got primary data, there are kind of ways around it. And as we said, primary data is preferred, but it's a valid way of kind of getting data through that proxy data if that's, especially as a kind of first step, is easier for you. Once you've submitted and entered these fields, if I click no to all these, I missed the first, this is going to NA them like this. Once you've done this, you'll see you can then mark that section as complete, and then this tick will appear here. So it's really important, once you've completed a section, mark it as complete, and then you can see that's done. If you realise, oops, I've forgotten to add the petrol van miles that we've done, we can just untick it and then enter it here. But it's just more so it's kind of a little check mark to kind of know that that section's complete. So I won't go into that much detail for the remaining tabs. I appreciate obviously that was a lot of information, but that was just really just to kind of show you all the different kind of aspects of the report and what data you need. So what I'll do now is I'll go through the other tabs in a bit more high level, just to show you what data you need. So what I'll do is just show you kind of fossil fuels, other tabs, and then we'll go into a bit of a dashboard demo. So the next section is fossil fuels. This is for things kind of like power and plant, basically anything like that, including natural gas usage, gas oil, etc. With this, or like machinery and that sort of thing. With this section, you can also record your company travel or third party travel in terms of the litres of fuel used instead. So it's really important with that you do either or. So don't double count the data. So if you have covered the miles travelled in diesel company car, for example, don't add the litres of diesel here as well. But if it's easier for you to get the information of how much diesel, for example, for your company fleet you've purchased or whatever for 2024, you can enter it here instead. So that's just an option available to you. Um, but with this section, basically, as I said, really important to look at the units to make sure that that the data you're entering is accurate. And with this, we've got another drop down here that if you do have other types, and there's a few other options there as well. Once it's completed, you can mark the section as complete. As you'll see, when if you haven't submitted all the sections, you'll get this pop-up basically saying that not everything's been completed. So you'll have to, fill everything out and then mark sections complete. So I think that's something important to note is if you're doing it, it's like, oh, why won't it let me mark the sections complete? It'll just be because one's not marked NA or this hasn't been checked to no or yes or something like that. So it's just data validation to make sure that you've entered all the information and haven't missed anything. With this tab, fugitive emissions, this is basically the emissions from refrigerants. If you've got any questions, as I said, there's the I help section here. But basically, obviously, if you don't have any refrigerants, then you won't have any fugitive emissions. But it's just if you do have this, this is where you can enter it, and you can enter which one and the bulk, the quantity, etc. Here. One of the more straightforward tabs, one of my favorites, is the electricity tab. So this is basically the core of it is basically your grid electricity usage as a company for 2024. So this can be taken directly from your electricity bills, um, added together across the year. If you've got multiple sites that you operate across, just then basically added together in kilowatt hours, and that's that value just added there. Basically, that's all you have to do for this one. This one's hopefully a fairly straightforward piece of information to get across your organisation from bills. And then, as you can see here, there is kind of a couple of other toggles, which are just kind of extra things. So, for example, if you have a renewable tariff, you can enter this here, or if you've got, you'll see it broken down on your bill. So, but if you don't, obviously just click no. And this last question is about whether you generate renewable energy on site. So this is basically, have you got any solar panels or, I don't know, kind of hydroelectric power or anything like that on site or any of your locations? You can click yes, and just the quantity of electricity that were generated across the year and by those methods. But if you don't, you just click no. And once you've entered this data, you then click mark section as complete, and that section's done. So that's kind of electricity, and then the rest of the tab, we've got materials, waste, water, homeworking. So the materials section will probably be quite relevant to a lot of you. I can imagine you probably do either produce or kind of handle a lot of materials as a part of your operations. So it's broken down into two sections. So you've got, do you manufacture products from raw materials or do you handle materials in your day-to-day operations? So the kind of difference with this is basically the top one, if you're maybe manufacturing concrete, you'd enter the materials in the top section, but if you're laying concrete as a groundworks contractor, you do it in the second section. So that's just that differentiation for whether you're actually producing the product or handling it to do a project, basically. The actual material types in both sections are the same, but it's just that differentiation. So for example, with the manufacturing products from raw materials, if you click yes, you can see that you've got a drop down here of a selection of different material types, and basically you can set them out, select the tons of that type, and then you might also have some concrete, so you can do that. You'll also notice here that there's also an option for low carbon concrete as well. So this is basically if you've made that transition from regular concrete to low carbon concrete, you can enter that here, and that'll obviously reduce your company's carbon emissions if you are using low carbon concrete. So you can kind of demonstrate kind of your commitment to sustainability and that sort of thing. With that option, we've got a selection of different kind of types here. So really just kind of have a look through and add anything. And same with low carbon steel as well. We've got that option as well if you kind of made that switch from regular steel to low carbon steel, for example. I won't go through the handle because that's the same, but essentially enter them. If there's a material that is listed that you use that isn't listed, and basically just don't enter that data if it's not listed. But if you do want to let us know that you use X material and that it's not included, because what we do is we kind of, if we get a few asks for that material, we'll then add it to the list, the drop down list. So feel free to reach out just to say that it isn't listed, Just FYI, and I'll make a note of that. But most materials are listed, obviously not super specialist ones, but for the most part, they'll be kind of listed here. Um, and then that's the material section. And then we go on to waste. So the waste section, it's got that kind of toggle. You click yes. You then basically have a selection of different waste types, and then within those, the destinations of those wastes. So for example, if you've got, yes, I've got information on plastic waste, you click yes, and then you can do from the drop-down list where those materials are going. So are they being recycled, against a landfill, being combusted, etc. So say, for example, if they are getting combusted, you could then enter the tons of plastic that for that year your organisation has combusted, if you've recycled, etc. Basically, and you can do this for all the different sections, all the different kind of material destinations and waste destinations. As I said before, if you don't have information on these waste types or waste tool, that's fine. That you just have to click no. If you do want to put a little explanation here just to say something, we're not currently collecting information or whatever, just so we know. That goes for kind of any other sections. If you don't have data for it, you feel free to add a comment just to kind of explain why. Just so that we kind of know, and also kind of Wates can kind of see where you're at with collecting the data. That'd be really useful. This tab, water, my personal favorite because it is one metric, which is lovely. So this is basically your water usage across your business for 2024 in litres. So again, hopefully this is a fairly straightforward data point to collect, and just from your water bills or however you collect your kind of or pay for your water, you'll be able to see the usage on there. And like I said, it's in litres, add it together across sites for the year, and you enter this here. The kind of next tab is home working. So this is a fairly new addition, because obviously, I appreciate in the last few years, more and more people are working from home, myself included. So for this section, if you do have employees who are either kind of home-based or have a hybrid kind of working style, you can add the basically the annual full-time equivalent home working hours here. So with this, again, we're not expecting necessarily to have a tally of every hour that an employee spent working from home. But if you might have 20 employees who are, full-time working from home, they work, 8 hours a day, however many days a year, that sort of thing, and you can just calculate basically an approximation of the home working hours, for example. So you don't have to be having a tally for everyone's, minute by minute, but it's just kind of, this is just something that, as I said, with the greenhouse gas protocol, this is included in kind of carbon reporting as kind of good practice. So if you do have any employees working from home, add their hours in here. If not, just click no. And obviously, mark section is complete as well. It's important. The final tab, kind of when it comes to inputting data, is other emissions. This is basically if you've got anything else that the scope 3 emissions of or whatever that's not been asked for in this report, you can add this here. So so for example, if you're a really specialist product manufacturer and use very special materials that aren't included in the drop down, if that is a large portion of your operations, you can calculate them yourself. Obviously, you don't have to do that, but if you do want to kind of go that extra steps and add things like that, you can do it here. Or if, for example, I don't know, the computers that you use in the office, when you bought them from the manufacturer, they actually kind of came with, they gave you the information of what the embodied carbons, really what the carbon emissions like were to produce that product. If you know that information, you could add this here. This is all optional, just it's more so if you've got something extra, add it. But obviously, if you don't have it, just click no. And just to point out that going back to that simplified report that I mentioned earlier, basically that report is these last three tabs only. So it's just emissions, scope 1, 2, and scope 3, and then policies and company information. That's all you have to do if you've already calculated your emissions. It's just these last three tabs. And then the kind of last two tabs are more qualitative data. So this section is just policy and strategies. So really this is just for you to demonstrate to Wates and to us and to kind of your clients what things you're doing kind of towards sustainability, what commitments you've made. So for example, I know kind of discussed earlier about goals Wates have of having, I think it's 80 or 90% of their supply chain to have set science-based targets by 2027. So if you've already got science-based targets, fantastic. Click yes, upload your documentation. So then wait, say, okay, great. X. You've already done that, so they don't have to kind of worry about that. If you've got any accreditation, that sort of thing. If you don't have any of this, you're not gonna like it's not you're gonna get penalised for not. It's just purely so that you can show us what you're doing and sustainability, and importantly, show your clients as well. But as I said, if you don't, just leave it as mark the section no, and then mark the section complete. The final tab is some company information. So just to clarify, this full report, none of your clients will see the full thing. The only people who see your full report would be me and any of kind of our team. And we won't obviously share any of the information in this report with any of your clients. Say, for example, Wates or your other clients, they'll only see the sliver of your report that you've said is kind of related to them. So, for example, um, say for example, if you 10% of your emissions, you've apportioned those to Wates. Wates will only see 10% of this report, but they won't know it's 10%. So you don't have to worry about your clients seeing your turnover. You don't have to worry about your clients knowing how much of your revenue they represent as well. They won't know that information. That's all kept confidential and won't be disclosed. So just so if you're worried about that, that won't be shared. This section's really so that in the dashboards we can have what we call a normalized figure. I'll show you that afterwards, but basically it's really important that you do enter a turnover because then you can track your turnover per £1 million. So not your turnover, your carbon emissions per £1 million, and that's particularly useful looking year on year when hopefully you've submitted a few years of data. Because if your company has grown, maybe your profits or your turnover has doubled, fingers crossed, in 3 years, for example. You can still see the relative direction of your company's emissions. So even if your carbon emissions have gone up over those 3 years because your company's grown, actually per £1 million, they actually might have gone down because even though your turnover might have doubled, your emissions might have only gone up 25%, for example. So that's a really important one to kind of be able to track your progress over time relative to the size of your organization. And that's the same with these employees as well. Once you've done that, you'd click submit report here, done. But obviously you have to click all the sections. It won't let me do it. But you need the green tick. So you can click done here, but it won't go to the green tick until you've completed all the sections. And the last stage of the report is the apportionment section. So this is where you can distribute your emissions to your clients. So for example here, if I was to go down to Wates right at the bottom, you can see, okay, Wates, fantastic. Out of the turnover that we had in 2024, Wates represent 4.56%, for example. You can enter that here. You can do this to as many decimal places as you want. I'd say, the more accurate this percentage is, the better, because that's the more accurate than the distribution of emissions to Wates is. But as I said before, with this, if you see, as you can see, this drop down list, we've got absolutely loads of clients using the column calculator. So if, for example, you also have got a project in 2024 with Wilmot Dixon. You can also then add in, okay, they represented 2.13% of our emissions, for example. And then you might think, okay, actually, Agri Industries, we had a project with them, etc. So even if Agri Industries haven't asked you to apportion your 2024 data to them, what I'd really recommend is go through this list and anyone that you've worked with in 2024, calculate the apportionment percentage and add it, because the thing is that they're likely to ask you separately, and if you've already done this for Wates, then they won't contact you, because even if you're on their target list too and you're part of their core supply chain, if you've already reported and apportioned your emissions to them, they're going to not contact you. You don't have to worry about like being pestered about it. Basically, you just kind of do it and then hopefully just kind of forget about it for the remainder of the year. So I just really recommend that alongside Waits, if anyone else that you're working with is on that list, just apportion to them, because you can retrospectively add it, but obviously you'll have to log back in and do that, and it is a straightforward process, but it might be easier to do that kind of all in one go. Once you've done that, you click save, and then you'd be able to submit the report. Obviously, I'm not going to do that because there's a test account, but just to kind of show you the reporting interface. So what I'll do, I'm aware we've got 10 minutes left, so what I'll do is I'll just show you the dashboards just so you've got an idea of what that then looks like once you've submitted it, and then we'll kind of go through some questions and things. And as I said, if we don't have time to go through the questions, I can send out some follow-up emails just to kind of answer specific questions as well. So your dashboard looks like this. Basically, you've got a selection of graphs and figures and that sort of thing. As I said before, this is a demonstration account, so the data won't make sense. It's just purely for kind of just to represent what the dashboards would look like. So you can see here, you've got this pie chart showing your emissions broken down by scope. You can see your total emissions, but you can also filter this by year as well. So you can see, for example, or 2023 emissions or 2024, whatever. If you haven't submitted data, for example, this account, we haven't submitted 2024 data, it'll just say no data reported. So don't be alarmed, that'll just be because there's no data. You can see here your emissions over time. So you can see how they've changed and also the percentage change as well here. So for example, you can see between 2019 and 2020, you can see that in this example, the emissions have actually dropped by 27%. And so that's really useful to just kind of have a look at that percentage change over time. As I said before, this will be more beneficial once you've got more data in your account, like kind of year on year. But some of you may already have accounts and always submit reports before, in which case you better see. With this section is not making any sense, but basically this is that total emissions per £1 million of turnover. So you can see your relative emissions kind of over time. So even if your business grows, you can see per £1 million of turnover, what are your emissions there. And then with this hotspots part briefly, I'll just quickly cover this. This is that aspect I was talking about before about measuring hotspots. So this is where you can go in here and say, okay, what are my carbon emissions by activity? And this is where you can look in and see, okay, like for our organization, in this example, you can see that company transport is actually contributing massively to the overall carbon emissions because all of these are in tons of carbon equivalent, just for context. And as you can see in this example, company transport significantly contributing. You can see that electricity consumption is having a negligible impact on your overall emissions. You see that water is quite a significant contributor. So it's just really for you to get a bit of a view of what activities are actually contributing to carbon emissions the most. Obviously, or maybe not obviously, but things like your fossil fuel usage, your materials usage and production, things like that, they're going to have more of an impact on your emissions because they're more carbon intensive. So particularly if you're a steel manufacturer, for example, obviously the steel that you're manufacturing is going to have a lot of carbon emissions associated with it. So that'll kind of that'll have an impact, but it's just kind of good to get a bit of a view. And you can always see it broken down by scope if you're interested or if anyone in your team's interested in that. And you've also got this total per £1 million and per kind of just total as well. With these kind of icons, if, for example, I wanted to look at fossil fuels, I can click on this and I can actually then get a graph that comes up down here showing all the years. Or similarly, if I do electricity consumption, for example, you can see year on year the relatively electricity consumption. As I said, this is a demo account, so we've only actually got 1 year of that data. But basically, you can kind of have a look and compare graphs. If you wanted to compare two indicators at one time, KPIs, you can kind of do a comparative graph. But just if you're interested, you can kind of play around with it there. So what I'll do is I'll just log out and just show you, and I'll send you a link afterwards, how to create an account. You basically go to supplier account, fill out your information, make sure you submit your company name in full so that that we know who you are and you know who you are. What we'll do when you register, if your account already exists in the system, you'll be able to have the option to join that account. So basically that means that one of your colleagues has already created an account and you can join it. So just to make you aware, if that does pop up, just join that account and that's no problem at all. And kind of finally, if you do have any questions specifically when you're doing this, or you just kind of want some more information, we have got this chat bot here that pops up on the screen. So if you've got any kind of questions, you can ask the chat bot. And that should be able to help you. And if not, your query will be kind of triaged to our help email address, and then one of my colleagues will get back to you. So that's there to help you with the process. And if you do have any kind of specific questions, we have this bit here, which is measure your own emissions. And so this section would be for Wates, this section is for you. If you click learn more, you'll be taken to our full landing page where you can really get some more information about what I've covered today, key takeaways. We've got kind of a little short form video for each tab in the report if you've got any specific questions that you want to kind of go back on. And then crucially, I think one of the really most important resources here is this carbon calculator guide, which is really a comprehensive guide that details everything in more detail. It kind of gives you tips about where you can collect data, what data sources to use, etc. So I'd really recommend that you have a look through this guide because I think it's really, really useful and hopefully will kind of help answer some questions. Just kind of, actually, I know it kind of sometimes happens, you could kind of get told a lot of information and then afterwards you're like, oh, I should have asked that. So feel free to do this. I'll send the link directly to this guide as well, to the email as well. So what I'll do now, I'll stop sharing. I think now would be the perfect opportunity. I know we only have 3 minutes left, to just go through and actually just go through the Q&A. As I said, if we don't get through everything, I'll follow up with everyone separately as well. But hopefully we've got a few minutes, so I'm sure we can kind of get through the majority of questions. It's got here, is there an opportunity to capture and report monthly? So actually, when the calculator was first created, you did have the option, this is a good few years ago, you did have the option to either select a quarterly, a monthly, or an annual account. So that meant that you could really report at different frequencies. But what we found is that with the monthly and quarterly accounts, we were getting a lot of incomplete data because, a company would submit 3 out of the 4 quarters or 8 out of 12 months. And actually the reporting burden was actually proving a lot more demanding than like initially expected for suppliers. So we sent out a really big survey to kind of everyone who was using the system, and basically the unanimous feedback was that trying to report on a quarterly or monthly basis was just actually in practice too frequent and to actually kind of keep up with long term. So that's why the report is now standardized to once a year. So basically you create an account and the standard is that you have an annual account. For some of you, if you did create your account a few years ago, you might be on a quarterly or monthly account. So if you're happy to keep that frequency, you can. But if you'd like to change it, I'll send details of our kind of our help email address, basically info@sustainabilitytool.com, and you can send an email to them and basically request that your account frequency is changed to annual, if that would be easier for you. So see here, do you have any template documents to help collect relevant data? So we do have on this on the landing page, there is a metric guide. So if I reshare my screen here quickly, this metric guide here, if you load this, it's a full Excel file basically detailing everything that's on the system. So I clicked here, metric guide, and then it comes up here, and it's basically a full Excel file that lists everything in the system just in an Excel format. So if you want to download this and then kind of create this as your own copy, then you can use this to kind of see, okay, these are the questions that are asked, and then you can kind of use this if you'd rather collect the data in Excel, distribute different teams and then submit it, and you can do it that way. So we do have that resource available. So let's have a look at the questions. So yeah, question to confirm, companies with existing scope 1, 2, and 3 data only to complete the last 3 tabs. Yeah, so basically, if you already know, you'll need to click yes to that that question in the first step of the report, which do you already know your company's organization? So basically, I'll just share my screen again. Essentially, if you already know your company's carbon emissions, so back on the test account, if we go to new report, if you already know your carbon emissions, you just click yes to this question and then it'll refresh. And then when you go on to this carbon report, it'll just be a shortened version of it with just the scope 1, 2, and 3. So just make sure that when you do that, you click yes to this question and then it'll take you to the right report. And so if you already do know your emissions broken down by scope 1, 2, and 3, you can do it that way. Sorry, but I keep sharing my screen and then flicking up again. I hope that's not too distracting, but I wanted to kind of help. So I think I know we're kind of over time. Not sure if anything you wanted to add before we go, or you're kind of happy with everything covered. And just to reiterate as well that the deadline for this report and for 2024 data is the 5th of March 2025 as well.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Annabelle. And I'm sure um, anyone who's got questions, obviously, I think there's an email there, and through the forms and the links that'll be shared, you can reach out to Annabelle and the team.
Mhm.
For those who weren't here at the beginning, just to declare, my name is Ade Tunjilawal, and I'm the group head of energy and carbon for Wates. We're really pleased that you're able to join today, and please enjoy the rest of the day. For if there are some colleagues that you feel in your company, in your organization, that are involved in carbon accounting for yourselves, and you want to be part of this, and you feel ideally should be on this session, there is a second session tomorrow, late in the afternoon. I believe Annabelle, that's
Yes,
about
10 till
what
12, 10
time?
till 12 to 1, I think.
Yes, about 12 to 1. So please let them join that as well. And I'm sure there'll be a lot more questions that can be picked up at that session as well. So thank you very much. I think we're 2 minutes over time now, and you'll want to get on to very important things for the rest of the day. So
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you for your time, everyone. Really appreciate you coming. As I say, if you've got any questions, I'll send out a follow-up email with our kind of info at email address if you've got any queries afterwards to kind of we'll triage them there as well. Yeah, thank you for your time. And as I said, hope you have a lovely rest of the day and it's only a lovely weekend. It's actually only Thursday, so a lovely weekend when it does come around.